So let's go ahead and look at the layout for the fabric. So I sent this email, or I emailed this picture out to everyone, but I wanted you to take a look at this. This is a picture that one of the other professors sent me. We have one other professor teaching a different section of this course. And so she sent me this image, which is a really great example of a layout for all of your pattern pieces. So we started to go over this last class, but you can see the white selvage on the edge of her fabric. So all of her pieces are facing up the same way. And then all of the grain line is going parallel to that selvage. And she went ahead and printed out 2 of anything that is a cut 2. So she's got one of the back pieces facing up and then the other one facing down that way. And she just cut out 2, that way she could lay it out and get everything laid out before starting to cut. And then same with the sleeve. You can see here she printed out 2 of those and then just did one face up and one face down. So this is a really good example of a layout. You're welcome to use this to cut out your fabric. You can also use this space over here. You'll see there's extra space. So if you want to lay out your pieces there, you could do that as well. So last class, we talked about prepping your fabric. You want to start by pre-washing your fabric, ironing out any of the wrinkles that may come from the drying process, and then getting your fabric on grain. And then this would be the fourth step, which would be laying out your pieces and getting them cut. So that's where we're starting from today. Over here, you can see I've got my back pieces laid out here, left and right, and then I've got my front up top. The other pattern piece that we're going to be working with today is that fusing. And I did notice one mistake on the pattern, so I want you to take note of this and make sure that you correct it. This one just says cut 1, and in reality it needs to be cut 2. So that was a mistake that I made when I was making the pattern. So that needs to be a cut 2. You'll need 2 of those, 1 for each back piece. So the first thing we're going to do, and I've got my little fusing pieces cut out here. The first thing we're going to do is actually put those fusing pieces on our back. So I'm going to flip this over to the wrong side of the fabric. And I should have notches at the top and bottom that show me where that fold line is. So that dashed fold line is where the notches are. We want to put our piece, our fusing piece, right in the center of that. So that notch should be hitting right at the center of the fusing area. And then we're going to scoot it up to where you just have an 1/8 of an inch gap here at the top and down the edge. So you'll have a little bit larger gap down here. That's just because we have a wider seam allowance down at the bottom. Okay. And now I'm going to let my iron set on there and get that adhered. And I'll go ahead and start placing this other one while I'm waiting. Okay. So next thing we're going to do is fold and press this on that fold line. So again, the fold line on your pattern piece is that dashed line. There's a notch at the top and the bottom. So right where those notches are, I'm going to fold my fabric back towards the wrong side and press it down the length. Same for my other piece. And then for this garment, we typically would serge the areas that would fray. But again, for this semester, we don't have our sergers. So we are going to use a combination of our pinking shears and then stitching welt seams to keep the edges from fraying. But right here, so this part that we just folded back is an example of a like self button facing. So when you stitch on your buttonholes, you always need 2 layers to stitch onto. And there's a couple different ways to get that second layer on the back. One way would be a facing, like what we did on our armhole last class, where it's an actual separate piece of fabric that you sew on and it would sit on the inside of the garment. Or like we just did, if it's a straighter area, you can just extend your pattern piece and fold it back to create that second layer. So that's what we just created right there. But this second layer, the raw edge is going to be visible on the inside. So we need to pink that with our pinking shears just to make sure that that raw edge does not fray. And when you pink this, I want you to cut off the least amount possible. So what I'm going to do is put this raw edge right at the peak of my zigzag. So if this is my zigzag and the peak is where it goes in, I'm going to put the raw edge right there. So I'm only cutting off tiny little triangles. I don't want to cut off a significant portion of my fabric because then I'm going to be losing that fabric that I need for that second layer. So you can see I'm just cutting off tiny little triangles and lining up the raw edge with the inside of that zigzag. Okay, so there is an example of my cut. You can still see I still have the majority of my fabric. You want to keep the most amount possible. Same for this one. So I'm just creating that pink right on the edge. You can see I cut off the least amount possible. Okay, now we're ready to start marking our buttonholes. So we're going to go ahead and stitch our buttonholes early on in this garment process, because for this particular garment, it will be easiest to do so. Once we get our front and our back bodice sewn together, those are going to be in a circle, and it makes it a little bit harder to stitch the buttonhole without the back or the front of the garment getting in the way in this case, since our buttonholes are on the back. So we're going to stitch them earlier on so that we have a nice flat piece of fabric to stitch them on, and we're not worried about other areas of the garment getting in the way. So buttonholes, we've got our buttons and our buttonholes marked on our pattern. So the I shape is the actual hole, and then the drill hole that's right in the center is where the button is going to sit. These are vertical buttonholes, so the button doesn't need to be shifted off to the left or right, because as the garment pulls, the button is going to stay right in the middle. So I'm going to lay this face down. Our buttonholes will be on the left and our buttons will be on the right. We won't stitch our buttons on right now. We'll wait until later. But I'm going to line this up face down, and you should be able to see through the paper, or if you want to print off a second version that's flipped, you can. And then I'm going to grab my awl, and I'm going to mark the top and the bottom of those eyes. Okay, and you can see I lined up So if you want to go ahead and fold this back, you can. But I lined up that folded notch area with the fold on my fabric. Okay, and the rest of this should line up perfectly all the way around the edge. And then mark the top and bottom. So you can see where I put a little hole through the paper at the top and the bottom of that eye. So now I can take my ruler and connect the dots to create those little eye shapes for my buttonholes. Okay, and then we always want to do our little end caps at either end. So I'm going to do the little horizontal line that marks the beginning and the end of the buttonhole. And these buttonholes are sized for 1/2-inch buttons, so you need to make sure that's what you purchased. If you purchased anything bigger or smaller, the buttonholes will not be the proper size. Okay, so now you can see where I've got my buttonholes marked, and I'm ready to go start stitching those. So let's head over to our machine. Okay, over here, I've already got my buttonhole foot on. And one thing that's important to note is that these buttonholes are made for the size of a 1/2-inch button. And that's what you were asked to buy for this particular garment. If your button is larger or smaller, then these buttonholes will not end up being the correct size. So make sure that your buttons are a 1/2-inch button. Okay, so setting up my machine, I've already got my buttonhole foot on here. Off to the side, I'm going to punch the button for my buttonhole function. So make sure you switch to that buttonhole function and that you're not still on just a straight stitch. And then for my machine, mine stitches backwards from the bottom up. So I'm going to go ahead and start at the bottom of that I, capital I, and then I'm stitching in black thread so that it's easy to see on camera, but I want y'all to stitch in matching thread to your fabric so that it blends in. I'm gonna go ahead and let my machine do its thing. So again, mine is automatic and it switches between sides. Yours, you may have to manually switch between sides depending on your machine model. So there's my first buttonhole stitched. Now I'm going to move on to my second one, do the same process for each of them. So there are my 3 buttonholes, all stitched. Okay, let's go ahead and trim these up, and then we'll start connecting our front bodice to our back bodice. Now I'm going to just trim off all of my excess threads, And for now, I'm not going to worry about cutting open my buttonholes just yet. I don't want to allow my fabric to fray as I manipulate it to stitch my garment. So I'll wait until the very end and cut those buttonholes later whenever we're ready to sew on our buttons. Okay, so now we've got both sides of our back ready to go. We're going to grab our front piece here, and we're going to lay that right sides together with our back. Okay, and we're going to match up our shoulders and our side seams. So I'm going to do shoulder first here. And you'll have a 1/2 inch notch near the armhole that you need to match together. And then just make sure those raw edges are even. And then I'm going to do also the side seam. You'll notice when I lay this nice and flat on the table, my side seam does not completely match up here. That is okay. We are going to pull it over to match. Our back and our front are just 2 different shapes. They're not the exact same shape. So that's why they don't match up when they're laying flat. And then I'm going to do the same for the other one, for the other back piece. These 2 back pieces will stay separated like this until we get our skirt sewn on and our buttons put in place, because those buttons are what's going to connect the 2. Okay, we're gonna do welt seams for all of our seam allowances. So the first thing we're gonna do is a plain 1/2 inch seam. We'll come back, press it, and then we'll do our top stitching for the welt. So first things first, we're gonna go stitch each of these at 1/2 inch. Okay, I'm gonna switch back to my standard foot. And then make sure to switch my stitch back to a standard straight stitch. And this should be at a standard 2.5 stitch length. And then we're going to do our 1/2 inch seam for each of these. So line it up with that 1/2 inch marking on your machine. So that was one shoulder. Now I'm going to switch over to my side seam. And then same thing for the other half of my garment, shoulder and side seam. So there's side seam and shoulder for each half. Okay, let's go back and press these, and then we'll get started on our welt or top stitching. Start by trimming all of the threads that are hanging off of your seams. And you want those trimmed as close to the surface of the fabric as you can get, so you don't have any thread sticking off. Okay, next thing we're going to do is finish the raw edge. So we're going to use our pinking shears again to trim each of these seam allowances before we open them. So right now, I'm going to trim both of those layers at the same time. And again, taking off the least amount of fabric possible and just putting that zigzag right at the very edge of the fabric. The combination of this pinking edge and the welt top stitching will help keep our fabric from fraying. Now we're going to bust each of these open. And I'm going to grab a roll. You can just lay these flat on your table like this and just press that little section with the tip of your iron. Or if you have your ham, a pressing ham, you can stick your ham into the armhole and press with that. Or there's another thing called a pressing roll. You'll actually get this one next semester. But anything that you can stick in there to help you kind of isolate that seam that you're about to press, it'll help you keep from getting wrinkles on the rest of the garment as you press it. But we're going to go ahead and bust that open first. That way we get that really nice flat professional seam on the outside of our garment. And then for the welt seam, we press both of these over to one side. In our sample, we just pressed them over to the right because we didn't have the reference of an actual garment. But in this case, we do. So I'm going to press them towards the back. This is the back of my garment because we've got that button up back. So I'm going to press both of those facing the back of the garment. I'm going to do that for all 4 of those seams that we just stitched before moving on. So you can see on the front of my seam here, because I did that bust and I busted it open and pressed it first, I've got a really nice flat seam on this side and my seam is not pleating over towards one side. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to pin each of those from the outside because we're about to do our top stitching that will secure down those 2 seam allowances to the side that we pressed. So I'm going to go ahead and pin these to keep those folded over until I can top stitch them down. Okay, let's go do our top stitching to secure down those seam allowances. Okay, back over here, I'm going to use that seam as my guide and place that at that 1/4 inch marking on my foot. And now you might be able to see it's a little bit thicker on this side. So that's where my seam allowances are. I should be stitching on top of those. I should not be stitching on the other side where there are no seam allowances. So make sure you're on the right side of the correct side of the seam. Use that seam as your guide, place it with the 1/4 inch marking on your foot, and then we'll do a permanent stitch. So that was one side seam. Zoom out a little bit so you can see my garment. I did the side seam from the hem up to the arm, and now I'm going to do that shoulder area from the armhole out to the neckline. This is just the way that I find it easiest to stitch. And then same on the other side. Work my way out. Nope, I got it right. Stuff that didn't want to go under the foot. There we go. Okay, so there is an example of one seam. That's one of my shoulder seams where I've got my original seam line here, and then a 1/4 inch away, I've got my top stitching line. Okay, let's go trim this up, and then this is where we will stop for today. As always, trim off those little thread tails to clean up before you move on to the next step. Okay, so now we have a front bodice. So this is from the front with our welt seams facing towards the back of the garment. And then right now from the back, we've got those two separate sides. Again, these will get connected when we put those buttons on and we button it closed. It will also get connected at the bottom here whenever we start to sew our skirt onto that waistline.